As a Jesuit environmental economist, I have been deeply inspired by Pope Francis's groundbreaking encyclical Laudato Si. With this remarkable document, Pope Francis addresses key ethical challenges of the 21st century: climate change, poverty, and inequality. Laudato Si emphasizes the necessity to protect global commons such as the atmosphere, forests, global water cycle, and oceans for the well-being of all people. The encyclical has been described by economist Jeffrey Sachs as Pope Francis's great and timely gift to humanity. Pope Francis offers an integral ecology which respects the fundamental interconnectedness of the economy, society, and environment. Because of this fundamental interconnectedness, the Pope states that we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. As the Pope eloquently exhorts, we need to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. How does an environmental economist respond to Laudato Si, one of the most profound contemporary directives on the inseparable faith of people and the planet? Can a market economist be a responsible steward of the planet and of the poor? Are markets friends or foes of Laudato Si? My main area of research and policy advocacy in environmental economics has been carbon trading, an approach to limit climate change by creating a market with limited allowances for carbon emissions. Carbon trading is the buying and selling of credits that permit a company or other entity to emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide. The carbon credits and the carbon trade are authorized by governments with the goal of gradually reducing overall carbon emissions and mitigating their contribution to climate change. Hence, I was quite jolted to read the encyclical's outright rejection of carbon credits. Laudato Si 171 reads, "The strategy of buying and selling carbon credits can lead to a new form of speculation which would not help reduce the emission of polluting gases worldwide. This system seems to provide a quick and easy solution under the guise of a certain commitment to the environment, but in no way does it allow for the radical change which present circumstances require. Rather, it may simply become a ploy which permits maintaining the excessive consumption of some countries and sectors." Laudato Si has a decidedly negative view of markets. The encyclical emphasizes certain dysfunctional tendencies and distortions of market economies. Monas, Murray, and Weiner summarize the encyclical's negative view as two criticisms of markets. First, much of the encyclical critiques free market ideologies as fundamentally flawed frameworks for distributing resources in an ethical manner, at least as currently practiced. The Pope specifically criticizes the pursuit of profit maximization, which he argues can harm future generations and the environment. Second, the encyclical is rooted in a concern that modern market-based economy leads to unjust results, primarily for the world's poor. The Pope dedicates two sections of the encyclical to global inequity and the inadequate governmental response. How would an environmental economist react to this harsh critique of market economies? A mainstream economic account might share many of these views, but it would have a different starting point. For an environmental economist, an understanding of markets, why they work, when they fail, and what lessons they offer for the design of environmental policies and the management of natural resources is central to an understanding of environmental issues. To illustrate how economic reasoning can help us understand and address environmental problems, let's take a look at perhaps the most pressing environmental issue addressed in Laudato Si, global climate change. The starting point of the encyclical is the scientific knowledge as summarized in the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that climate change is caused by humankind through the burning of coal, oil, and gas, through deforestation, and through the emissions of other greenhouse gases. The encyclical emphasizes above all the consequences of climate change for the poor. As such, it points out that they are the first to be affected by global warming and hit the hardest, namely because they depend more than other segments of the population on other agriculture and other ecosystem services, for example, fisheries, for their livelihood. Also, they are not in a position to protect themselves effectively against extreme weather events and water scarcity. Moreover, the lack of access to clean water, the loss of biodiversity, and increasing air pollution and the adverse effects on health are concerns for the Pope. He fears that the negative effects of global environmental change and resource use could lead to migration movements or even wars in the future. The environmental economists Cagayan and Olmsted give an economic perspective on climate change. What are the causes of climate change? From an economic point of view, the roots lie in the incentives facing individuals, firms, and governments. Each time we drive a car, turn on a light, or use a computer, we are directly increasing carbon emissions and thereby contributing to global climate change. In doing so, we impose a small cost on the Earth's population. However, these costs are invisible to the people responsible. You do not pay for the carbon you emit, nor indeed does the company that produces your electricity or the company that made your car. The result is that we all put CO2 into the atmosphere because we have no reason not to. It costs us nothing, and we receive significant individual benefits from the energy services that generate carbon emissions. Economics stresses the importance of incentives in shaping people's behavior. Without incentives to pay for the true cost of their actions, few people or firms will voluntarily do so. You might think at first that this is because the free market has prevailed. In fact, that gets it almost exactly backward. Very often, the problem is not that markets are so pervasive, but that they are not pervasive enough. That is, they are incomplete. There is simply no market for clean air or a stable global climate. If there were, then firms and individuals who contributed to climate stabilization by reducing their own carbon emissions or offsetting them would be rewarded for doing so, just as firms that produce automobiles earn revenue from selling cars. This is a key insight from economics. Many environmental problems would be alleviated if proper markets existed. Because those markets usually don't arise by themselves, governments have a crucial role in setting them up or in creating price signals that mimic the incentives a market would provide. So how can the right price signals be created such that people are incentivized to pay for a stable climate? Emissions can be reduced in myriad ways by requiring polluters to install and operate specific abatement technologies or to meet specific standards of performance at their facilities, by mandating tough energy efficiency standards for consumer appliances, and tightening fuel economy requirements for vehicles, by levying a tax on greenhouse gas emissions, or by capping emissions and allowing emitters to trade allowances under that cap. And that is hardly an exhaustive list. Both economic theory and experience provide compelling arguments for market-based policies such as emission taxes and cap-and-trade policies that harness market forces to achieve regulatory goals at less overall costs than traditional approaches. Metcalfe explains the economic logic of a market-based environmental policy instrument such as a carbon tax. Markets work best when the price of a good reflects all its costs. If the price of the good doesn't include all the costs, the damages from pollution, for example, then we are effectively subsidizing that good, and as a result, we'll consume too much of it. Because we don't include the costs of climate change in the price of fossil fuels, we consume more of them than is good for society. Taxing carbon aligns the price we consumers see with the true cost of using these fuels. People respond to prices. If we raise the price of fossil fuels to reflect their true cost, consumption falls. When gasoline prices rise, people drive less and buy more fuel-efficient cars. Lower carbon natural gas is burned to produce electricity in place of high carbon coal. Factories invest in more efficient furnaces to reduce their fuel combustion, and on in literally millions of decisions made by businesses and families across the country. While climate change is a moral issue, it is also an economic and technological one. Economic tools may help us to address the problem and should not be rejected out of hand. Monas, Murray, and Weiner argue that Laudato Si recognizes the value of market-based environmental policy. A careful reading of the encyclical suggests a more nuanced understanding of and a shared understanding that actually favors well-designed market-based climate policies such as carbon taxes and cap and trade. The encyclical repeatedly invites a dialogue regarding the environment, the economy, and public policy. Other provisions of the Pope's encyclical criticize a system that allows business to profit by calculating and paying only a fraction of the ecological and social costs involved in the production process. An efficient carbon market or tax, however, would require businesses to pay the full social and environmental costs of their emissions, not just a fraction. According to Pope Francis, an ethical market will not exist until the economic and social costs of using up shared environmental resources are recognized with transparency and fully borne by those who incur them. This language argues for internalizing the full social and environmental costs of greenhouse gas emissions, which is precisely the objective and method of carbon markets. Well-designed market-based climate policies could achieve the shared goal of fully internalizing environmental costs. More generally, when the encyclical criticizes reliance on markets, it is crucial to distinguish unfettered free markets from market-based environmental policies, which are reconstituted efficient markets. The Pope's criticism is of unfettered markets, the kind of markets that generate environmental harms. By contrast, market-based environmental policies such as taxes and cap and trade are not unfettered markets. Rather, they are the measures needed to correct unfettered markets. While critics of incentives may feel that the environment is too important to leave to markets, the better view is that environmental protection is too important to leave out of markets. The move to incorporate environmental values into markets through market-based policy instruments is part of a long process of reshaping markets to internalize social values that had been previously omitted. Therefore, the Pope's criticism of markets in general could be seen as an endorsement of market corrective policies. Edenhofer and Flachsland likewise argue that carbon pricing, which addresses climate change, could also address poverty. A limitation of the amount of carbon that is stored in the atmosphere by means of CO2 pricing will not only protect the climate and thus the poorest affected by climate change, but it will also provide a new source of income by creating tax revenues or auction emissions permits. The revenues from CO2 pricing could be used to provide the poorest with access to basic goods. A CO2 tax reform could be carried out by national governments by means of international coordination. To give an example, were the government of India to charge $10 for every ton of CO2 emitted, it could provide electricity, clean water, sanitation, and telecommunications for more than 60 million people every year. The same applies to China or Mexico. CO2 pricing is a potent means to be used in combating poverty. A first step in this direction would be to abolish subsidies for fossil fuels. That alone would free up at least $550 billion for investments to help the poor. Indeed, these measures would meet one of the key demands of the Pope, namely, to fight climate change and poverty at the same time. Economics can be at the service of Laudato Si by offering practical, market-based analysis and solutions. To understand environmental problems today, whether local ones like congestion, or national ones like air pollution, or global ones like global warming, requires understanding markets. Environmental economics argues that environmental degradation is the result of distorted market signals that put too low a price on harmful environmental effects. Climate change, the most perilous of all environmental problems, is taking place because virtually every country puts a price of zero on carbon dioxide emissions. It is noteworthy that ecological economics is one of the 7 Laudato Si goals in the Laudato Si Action Platform promoted by the Vatican Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. Environmental economics can be a partner in the protection of our common home. Working through the market can be most helpful in order to address the climate problems in ways that are scientifically meaningful, economically sensible, and ultimately politically pragmatic. Markets can be a friend of Laudato Si.